Hi, this is Mato. Welcome to my online chess lecture. This video is an introduction to chess gambits in chess. What is a gambit? A gambit is a chess opening in which a player, more often white, sacrifices material, usually a pawn, with the hope of achieving a resulting advantageous position. Where should we start? How should we start? Perhaps we'll start with the alphabetical order. We will start with Albin's counter gambit. It goes like this: d4, d5, c4, e5. After d takes on e5, black plays d4. Next is Awakens Defense. In Awakens Defense there are few gambits. One of them is Awakens Gambit. It goes like this: e4, knight to f6, e5, knight to d5, c4, knight to b6, d4, d6, knight to f3, bishop to g4, pinning the knight, unpinning, d takes on e5, knight takes on e5, and after bishop takes, queen takes on d4. Next one is John Tracy Gambit. It goes like this: e4, knight to f6, knight to f3, allowing knight takes on e4. How do you like this one? Next one is Spielmann's Gambit. It goes like this: e4, knight to f6, but now knight to c3, defending the pawn, d5, e5, knight from f to d7, e6. A pawn sacrifice to cramp black's position. Next one is Amar Opening. Have you ever heard of Amar Opening? It doesn't look very good. Never mind. Knight to h3, d5, g3, e5, f4, bishop takes on h3, e takes on f4. That's a crazy opening. It's called Paris Gambit. Who would play that, huh? Some people do. And there is a Grand Gambit in Amar Opening. Again, it starts with knight to h3, d5, g3, e5, f4, bishop takes on h3, bishop takes on h3, pawn takes pawn on f4, castling, f takes on g3, h takes on g3. Who would play that? Some people do. Next one is Benko Gambit. Benko Gambit is a serious opening. It goes like this: d4, knight to f6, c4, c5 like Benoni, but after d5, black plays b5. After pawn takes pawn, a6. Black has a good success with this opening. Next is Benko Opening Dada Gambit. It goes like this: g3, e5, bishop to g2, d5, b4. Dada Gambit. Next is Bird's Opening. These are not real birds. Bird is the name of a person. Starts with f4, and then we have e5. This is called From Gambit. And one game went like this. Pawn takes pawn, d6, pawn takes pawn, bishop takes on d6, knight to f3, knight to c6, h3, preventing bishop to g4, but didn't prevent bishop to g3. Checkmate. And then we have Bird's Opening, Sturm Gambit. f4, d5, c4. And then we have Swiss Gambit. It goes like this. f4, f5, e4, f takes on e4, knight to c3, knight to f6, g4. Wow. That's a bit risky for white, isn't it? Next is Williams Gambit. Williams Gambit goes like this. f4, d5, e4. Williams Gambit was invented by William. Surprise, surprise. Next is Bishop's Opening. There are many gambits in Bishop's Opening. I'm going to show you just a few. The e4, e5, bishop to c4, f5. This is called Calabrian counter gambit. And then there is 4 pawns gambit. It goes like this. e4, e5, bishop to c4, bishop to c5, b4, bishop takes on b4, f4, pawn takes pawn on f4, knight to f3, and now bishop goes back to e7, d4, bishop to h4 check, g3, f takes on g3, castling, pawn takes pawn on h2 check, king to h1. Is this good for white? Definitely maybe. Next one is Greco Gambit. Greco Gambit goes like this. e4, e5, bishop to c4, knight to f6, f4, knight takes on e4. And then white wants to play queen to h5. Interesting. Next is Russo Gambit. It goes like this. e4, e5, bishop to c4, knight to f6, d4, e takes on d4, knight to f3, and after knight takes on e4, queen takes on d4. Black is a pawn up, but badly behind in the development. One more. Bishop's Opening, Wing Gambit. e4, e5, bishop to c4, bishop to c5, b4. It may transpose to Evans Gambit. Next is Blackma-Dima Gambit. It goes like this. d4, d5, e4, d takes on e4, f3. Blackma-Dima Gambit. And there is Raida Gambit, which is a variation of Blackma-Dima Gambit. It goes like this. d4, d5, e4, d takes on e4, knight to c3, defending the pawn, f3, pawn takes pawn, and now queen takes on f3, allowing queen takes on d4. Raida Gambit. And one more, Hupsch Gambit. It goes like this. d4, d5, knight to c3, knight to f6, e4, knight takes on e4, knight takes on e4, d takes on e4, bishop to c4. Hoops Gambit. Next, Blomfeld Gambit. Blomfeld Gambit goes like this. It is a d4 opening. d4, knight to f6, c4, e6, knight to f3, c5, d5, b5. It reminds me of Gyaku Gambit. Next is Budapest Gambit. There are three gambits in Budapest Gambit. Standard Budapest Gambit, Awakens Gambit, and Ballo Gambit. d4, knight to f6, c4, e5. And after d takes on e5, this is Awakens Gambit. And if knight goes to g4, that is Ballo Gambit. This one is more popular. Next is Catalan Defense. Catalan Defense has three gambits: Algea Gambit, Godly Gambit, and Russo Gambit. Catalan is e4 opening. e4, c6, d4, d5, knight to c3, d takes on e4, knight takes on e4, knight to f6, and now bishop to d3, allowing queen takes pawn on d4. Next, Godly Gambit. e4, c6, d4, d5, e takes on d5, and now knight to f6. This time black is sacrificing a pawn. Next, Russo Gambit. It goes like this: e4, c6, d4, d5, knight to c3, d takes on e4, f3. It's sometimes transposition between this Russo Gambit and Black Madima Gambit. Next is Catalan Opening. Catalan Opening is a d4 opening. d4, d5, c4, e6, knight to f3, knight to f6, and now g3, allowing pawn takes pawn on c4. Catalan Opening, very popular on high level. Next is Danish Gambit. e4, e5, d4, e takes on d4, c3. Danish Gambit, standard Danish Gambit. And there is Algea Gambit. It goes like this: e4, e5, d4, e takes on d4, and now f4. Interesting, isn't it? Borrowing ideas from King's Gambit. Next is Dutch Defense. Dutch Defense has three gambits: Tracy Gambit, Lobster Gambit, and Staunton Gambit. d4, this is f5, Dutch Defense. g4, Tracy Gambit. And this is Lobster Gambit. e4, pawn takes pawn on e4, knight to c3, knight to f6, bishop to g5, and now c6 or g6. White plays f3. And then there is Staunton Gambit. It goes like this: d4, f5, e4. Staunton Gambit. Next is Elephant Gambit. Some people say that Elephant Gambit was invented by an elephant. May not be true. e4, e5, knight to f3, d5, elephant gambit. Then we go to English opening. There are two gambits in English opening. First one is called Balloon Gambit. It goes c4, e5, knight to c3, knight to f6, knight to f3, and now e4. Then knight to g5, and black plays b5, Balloon Gambit. Interesting. Next one is English opening Halibut Gambit. It goes like this: c4, b5. Interesting. Next one is England Gambit. It goes like this: d4, e5, d takes on e5, knight to c6, defending the pawn, queen to e7. And then after queen to d5, f6, pawn takes pawn, knight takes on f6. England Gambit. Next, Evans Gambit. Evans Gambit goes like this: e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop to c4, bishop to c5, b4. So this is Evans Gambit. But if black plays d5, this is then Evans counter gambit, leading to a crazy game. Next is Four Knights game. Four Knights game is e4 opening. e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, knight to c3, knight to f6, d4, e takes on d4, knight to d5. This is called Belgrade Gambit. Have you ever heard of Belgrade Gambit? There is a city in Europe called Belgrade, capital city of Serbia. Next is Halloween Gambit. It goes like this: e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, knight to c3, knight to f6, and now very crazy move. Knight takes pawn on e5. After knight takes knight, d4. Halloween Gambit in Four Knights game. Next is French defense. The legend says that French defense was invented by French people. I think this may be right. There are many gambits in French defense. I'm going to show you only few. First one is Milna Barry Gambit. It goes like this: e4, e6, d4, d5, French defense. Advanced variation. c5, standard move, defending the pawn. More pressure on the pawn on d4. Knight to f3, queen to b6, bishop to d3, c takes on d4, c takes on d4, bishop to d7 for a reason, knight to c3, knight takes on d4, knight takes on d4, queen takes on d4. And I watched a game when Tal played like this as white and won brilliantly. After castling, black can win one more pawn. And then white plays rook to e1. Black is 2 pawns up. Next is Nimzowitsch Gambit. It goes like this: e4, e6, d4, d5. It is again advanced variation. And after c5, g4. Is that a good way to play for white or not? Next is Vinava Alehin Gambit. It goes like this: e4, e6, d4, d5, knight to c3, bishop to b4, knight to e2, allowing pawn takes pawn. And just one more: French wing gambit. And I hope that lovers of French defense will forgive me because I'm not showing all French defense gambit openings. e4, e6, knight to f3, d5, e5, c5, b4, wing gambit. Next is Gyaku Piano. The legend says that Gyaku Piano was invented by Italians. It is e4 opening, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop to c4, knight to d4. This variation is called Blackburn Shilling Gambit. And one beautiful game goes like this: knight takes not knight, but pawn on e5, threatening to win the pawn on f7. Queen to g5, knight takes on f7, forking the rook and the queen. Queen takes on g2, attacking the rook. Rook to f1. Queen takes pawn on e4, check. Bishop to e2, knight to f3, checkmate. Blackburn Shilling Gambit. Blackburn won many games like this. There was no internet in those days. He was playing for money from this position. In this position, he offered to play for money, and he won as black. Next one is Italian Gambit. It goes like this: e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop to c4, bishop to c5, d4. I watched actually kids playing this, and kid that played d4, he thought it was a mistake. And I told him it's not a mistake, it's Italian Gambit. He didn't believe me. Never mind. Then we have Jeremy Gambit. It goes like this: e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop to c4, bishop to c5, and then you will not believe it. Bishop takes on f7, check. Jeremy Gambit. Next one is Russo Gambit. It goes like this: e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop to c4, f5. Interesting, isn't it? Looks like King's Gambit reversed. Next is Blomfeld Defense. Blomfeld Defense, Blomfeld Gambit. It goes like this: d4, knight to f6, c4, g6, knight to c3, d5, bishop to f4, bishop to g7, e3, castling. After c takes on d5, knight takes, queen takes. And then if bishop takes on c7, knight to a6. Black goes for a quick development of the pieces. Next is King's Gambit. King's Gambit is very popular gambit, and some people say that King's Gambit was invented by kings. Just kidding. Well, there are many gambits in King's Gambit. We are not going to go through all of them. Only few. Let's start with Algea Gambit. It goes like this. E4, E5, F4, pawn takes pawn on F4, knight to F3, G5, H4, G4, knight to G5. And now if black plays H6, knight takes on F7. Next is Bishop's Gambit. It goes like this. E4, E5, F4, pawn takes pawn, and now not knight to F3, but bishop to C4, allowing black to give check on H4. Next one is W Muzio Gambit. It goes like this. It's a crazy one. E4, E5, F4, pawn takes pawn on F4, knight to F3, G5, not only defending the pawn but threatening G4, bishop to C4, G4, and now, believe it or not, white castles kingside. Pawn takes knight, queen takes pawn, queen to F6, E5, queen takes on E5, bishop takes on F7 check. How do you like this opening? Very, very wild. Then, Morphy Gambit. It goes like this. E4, E5, F4, E5, E takes on the E5, E4, knight to C3, knight to F6, D3, bishop to B4. And just one more, my favorite King's Gambit. It is called Adelaide Counter Gambit. I don't know why is this my favorite. Maybe because it was invented in Adelaide. It goes like this. E4, E5, F4, knight to C6, knight to F3, and now F5. Adelaide Counter Gambit. Next is King's Indian Defense. In King's Indian Defense we have Danube Gambit. It goes like this. D4, knight to F6, C4, G6, and after D5, black plays B5. Danube Gambit. Next is Latvian Gambit. In Latvian Gambit there are three different gambits. Greco Counter Gambit, Lobster Gambit, and Swedenborg variation. Let's look at Latvian Gambit, Greco Counter Gambit. It goes like this. E4, E5, knight to F3, F5, Greco Counter Gambit. This one is Lobster Gambit. Some people claim it's invented by Lobster, but this is not true. E4, E5, knight to F3, F5, and now G4. Perhaps that is the reason why it's called Lobster Gambit. Next, Swedenborg variation. E4, E5, knight to F3, F5, knight takes on E5, knight to F6, bishop to C4, F takes on E4, knight to F7, forking the queen and the rook, queen to E7, knight takes rook. Wow, interesting. Latvian Gambit, Swedenborg variation. Next is Petrov Defense. Petrov Defense has three gambits: Boden-Kizeritsky Gambit, Coherent Gambit and Russo Gambit. Let's start with Bojan-Kiseritski Gambit. It goes like this. e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to f6, Petrov defense, bishop to c4, knight takes on e4, knight to c3, knight takes knight, d takes on c3, and then black plays f6. If black plays d6, white can capture the pawn on e5, but then queen to e7. He has to take on f7. This is one way to go for white, but the easy way to go is to play knight to g5. Okay. Next is Coherent Gambit. It goes like this. e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to f6, knight takes on e5, d6, and now, believe it or not, knight takes on f7. Coherent Gambit. Next, Russo Gambit. Goes like this. e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to f6, d4, e takes on d4, bishop to c4. Russo Gambit. Next is Philidor Defense. The legend says that this defense was invented by Philidor, and it's got 3 gambits: Loco Gambit, Lopez counter gambit, and Philidor counter gambit. Let's start with Loco Gambit. It goes like this. e4, e5, knight to f3, d6, d4, knight to f6, knight to g5, h6, knight takes on f7. Crazy Loco Gambit. Next is Lopez counter gambit. e4, e5, knight to f3, d6, bishop to c4, and then f5. Lopez counter gambit. And one more. Philidor counter gambit. e4, e5, knight to f3, d6, d4, f5. Philidor counter gambit. Next one is Ponciano Opening. Some people claim that this opening was invented by Ponciani. It goes like this. e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, c3, and then f5. This is Ponciani Opening, Ponciani counter gambit. This looks like a King's Gambit reverse, doesn't it? Next we have Queen's Pawn Opening. And in Queen's Pawn Opening we have Steinitz counter gambit. It goes like this. d4, d5, and after bishop to f4, c5. Maybe you played some of these gambits and you even don't know what they are called. And next one is very popular. Queen's Gambit Accepted. In Queen's Gambit Accepted we have Algea Defense. It goes like this. d4, d5, c4, d takes on c4, knight to f3, a6, e3, and then black can play b5 at his own risk, but perhaps bishop to f5 will be a better move. Next is Queen's Gambit Standard. d4, d5, c4. We will not go very deep into this one. This is the best gambit of all, Queen's Gambit. Next we go to Reti Opening. In Reti Opening we have 3 gambits. Sicilian Gambit, Reti Gambit and Tennyson Gambit. Starting with Latvian Gambit. After knight to f3, f5, e4, Latvian Gambit. Next, Reti Gambit. Knight to f3, d5, c4. That's a popular one. And then we have Tennyson Gambit. It goes like this: knight to f3, d5, and then white plays e4. Next is Ruy Lopez, very popular opening. Ruy Lopez, invented by Spanish priest Ruy Lopez. There are 6 gambits there, but I will only show you few of them. We'll start with Alpine Gambit. e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop to b5, a6, bishop takes knight on c6, d takes on c6, castling, pinning the knight, h3, and now h5. Black won many brilliant games like this after white captured the bishop. Next one is Marshall Gambit. Marshall Gambit goes like this: e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop to b5, a6, bishop to a4, knight to f6, castling, bishop to e7, rook to e1, b5, bishop to b3, castling, c3, d5. Marshall Gambit. And one more, Schliemann Gambit. It goes like this: e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop to b5, f5. Schliemann Gambit. Next is Scandinavian Defense. Legend says that Scandinavian defense was invented by Scandinavians. No surprise. e4, d5, e takes on d5, queen takes on d5, knight to c3 attacking the queen, queen to a5, and now b4. This is called Kotretz-Mises Gambit. After queen takes, on b4, rook to b1. Next is Marshall Gambit. I'm sure by now you know that Marshall enjoyed gambiting his pawns. e4, d5, e takes on d5, knight to f6. This may transpose to Portuguese Gambit. Next is Icelandic Gambit. It goes like this: e4, d5, e takes on d5, knight to f6, c4, e6. Icelandic Gambit. And Portuguese Gambit goes like this: e4, d5, pawn takes pawn on d5, knight to f6, d4, not defending the pawn, bishop to g4, Portuguese Gambit. Next is Scotch Game. In Scotch Game we have 3 gambits: Gering Gambit, Relfson Gambit, and Scotch Gambit. Let's start. e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, d4, e takes on d4, and now c3, Gering Gambit. After pawn takes pawn, sometimes White doesn't take. He may play bishop to c4, allowing pawn takes pawn on b2. Next is Scotch Gambit. It goes like this: e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, d4, e takes on d4, bishop to c4. Scotch Gambit. Next is Semi-Slav Defense. Semi-Slav Defense, we have three gambits: Anti-Meran Gambit, Marshall Gambit, and Anti-Moscow Gambit. Let's start with Anti-Meran Gambit. It goes like this: d4, d5, c4, e6, knight to c3, knight to f6, knight to f3, c6, bishop to g5. Anti-Meran Gambit. Next, Marshall Gambit. d4, d5, c4, e6, knight to c3, c6, e4, d takes on e4, knight takes on e4, bishop to b4 check, bishop to d2, and then queen takes on d4. Marshall Gambit. Next is Anti-Moscow Gambit. It goes like this: d4, d5, c4, e6, knight to c3, knight to f6, knight to f3, c6, pinning the knight, attacking the bishop, bishop to h4, g5, bishop goes to g3, pawn takes pawn, and after e4, and in this position what would you do? b5 or bishop to b4? Bishop to b4 looks like a stronger move. Next is Sicilian Defense. Some people say that Sicilian Defense was invented by Sicilians, and there are many gambits in Sicilian Defense. We are not going to go through all of them, only 57. Just kidding, 56. First one is Algea Gambit. It goes like this: e4, c5, d4, c takes on d4, knight to f3, e5, c3. Algea Gambit. Next is Mora Gambit. It goes like this: e4, c5, knight to f3, knight to c6, d4, c takes on d4, c3, and then after pawn takes pawn, knight takes on c3. Smith-Morran Gambit. And just one more. Wing Gambit. After e4, c5, white plays b4. So after pawn takes pawn, he can play d4 sooner or later. So he hopes. Next is Slav Defense. Three gambits in Slav Defense: Slav Gambit, Tolush Gela Gambit, and Vinova Counter Gambit. We'll start with Slav Gambit. It goes like this: d4, d5, d4, c6, knight to f3, knight to f6, knight to c3, d takes on c4, e4. Slav Gambit. Next is Tolush Gela Gambit. d4, sometimes they transpose, d5, c4, c6, knight to f3, knight to f6, knight to c3, d takes on c4, e4, b5, e5, Toulouse Gambit. Next one is Vinava counter gambit. It goes like this: d4, d5, c4, c6, knight to c3, and now e5. So instead of knight to c3, if white wants to avoid this Vinava counter gambit, he should play knight to f3. Next is Sikorski Opening. In Sikorski Opening we have Tartakova Gambit. Some call it Fischer Gambit. b4, e5, bishop to b2, f6. And after e4, black can win a pawn. Huh? Tartakova Gambit. Next is Danish Defense. In Danish Defense we have three gambits: Marshall Gambit, Danish Gambit, and von Henning-Schara Gambit. We'll start with Marshall Gambit. d4, d5, c4, e6, knight to c3, c5, Danish Defense, c takes on d5, e takes on d5, and now e4, Marshall Gambit. Next, Danish Gambit. d4, d5, c4, e6, knight to c3, c5, c takes on d5, e takes on d5, d takes on c5, d4, knight to a4, b5, Danish Gambit. And one more, von Henning-Schara Gambit. It goes like this: d4, d5, c4, e6, knight to c3, c5, c takes on d5, c takes on d4, von Henning-Schara Gambit. Next is Torre attack. In Torre attack we have Wagner Gambit. The attack is d4 opening. d4, knight to f6, knight to f3, e6, bishop to g5, Torre attack, c5, and now e4, Wagner Gambit. Next, two knights defense. In two knights defense I will show you 4 gambit openings. We'll start with Boden-Kieseritzky Gambit. It goes like this: e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop to c4, knight to f6, knight to c3, knight takes on e4, castling kingside, Boden-Kieseritzky Gambit. Next, Fried-Liva attack. e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop to c4, knight to f6, knight to g5, d5, e takes on d5, knight takes on d5. This is not recommended. Knight to a5 is better. Then knight takes on f7. Perhaps even better is d4, Lolly attack. But knight takes on f7 is Fried-Liva attack. King takes knight, queen to f3 check, forking the king and the knight. Next is two knights gambit. e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop to c4, knight to f6, knight to g5, d5, e takes on d5 to a5, two knights gambit. And after bishop to b5 check, c6, pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn. Black is fighting back. And one more. Drexler. Counter-attack. Official name is Wilkes-Barre Drexler variation. e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop to c4, knight to f6, and after knight to g5, black plays bishop to c5. After knight takes on f7, bishop takes on f2, leading to a crazy game. Black actually won many games like this. Next is Vienna game. Vienna game has 7 gambits. I'm going to show you only a few of them. So we have e4, e5, knight to c3, knight to f6, bishop to c4, knight takes on e4, queen to h5 threatening checkmate, knight to d6, bishop to b3, knight to c6, d4. This is called Adams Gambit. Next is Pierce Gambit. It goes like this: e4, e5, knight to c3, knight to c6, f4, pawn takes pawn on f4, knight to f3, g5, d4, g4, bishop to c4. How do you like this opening? White is losing a knight. Then we have Steinitz Gambit. It goes like this: e4, e5, knight to c3, knight to c6, f4, pawn takes pawn on f4, d4, allowing queen to h4 check. And then we have Vienna Gambit. e4, e5, knight to c3. This is preventing d5. If you immediately play f4, black can play d5. So white plays knight to c3, and only after knight to f6 or knight to c6, f4, Vienna Gambit. Next is Ware Opening. It goes like this: a4. What do you think of this? e5, a5, d5, e3, and after f5, black played a6. But this is not a serious opening, is it? Surely grandmasters don't play this opening. But there was one famous one. His name was Magnus. He played this opening and won the game. And in the coming days, I will show you that game that he won with this very funny opening. What do you think of Gambit openings? Do you play any Gambit openings? Did we exhaust all Gambits in this video? Yes, we did. No, we didn't. We have only scratched the surface. And that is all. I hope that you enjoyed watching this video. I wish you good luck with your chess, and bye for now.